welcome to today's book launch of The D Word, Perspectives on Democracy in Tumultuous Times here at the Recent Globe in Leipzig. So I'm Constanze Blum. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute Social Cohesion here and very happy to be moderating the session today. Now, today's event is held in the context of the Druckfrisch series, so freshly printed, which was founded in 2012 as a cooperation between the European Network in Universal and Global History and the Leipzig Recent Globe. And the series offers a forum for academic authors and for readers to meet and to discuss current contributions to regional, transnational studies and, of course, global history. Now, today's launch of the D Word, recently published with Nelson Mandela University Press, is, I guess, not only fitting perfectly into this format, but also extremely timely, because it addresses the globally perceived malaise or crisis of democracy. And I just want to highlight this is not the first launch of this book, but the first here in Germany, and as we discussed earlier, in the Northern Hemisphere, and deliberately also so in Leipzig, as of course the regional elections here in Saxony, in Thüringen and Brandenburg have shown quite drastically the democratic backlash with the far-right AfD party's electoral advances. But today we want to shift the focus from the often dominant Western, European and US narratives on this issue to perspectives from what the book calls the margins. And we have a wonderful panel with us today. As you can see, we are very privileged to have with us Professor Christie van der Westhuizen, one of the editors of this volume, which she has put together in collaboration with Siphiwe Dube and Soweto Jolobe. And we also have with us two of the contributing authors, and we warmly welcome Professor Rashid Boutayeb, who joins us today from Doha online. So thank you so much for being with us. And we also welcome Dr. Svetluza Surova, who came yesterday all the way from Bratislava, so welcome as well. And thank you also, of course, to Professor Ulf Engel, who is going to provide a commentary following the presentations by the authors. And you'll get a more detailed introduction for each speaker before their respective input. But before we start, also maybe a special welcome to a new senior fellow here at our institute, Professor Cheryl Hendricks, the Executive Director of the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation in South Africa, who's recently arrived to Leipzig and will be with us for the next 3 months. So welcome and thank you so much for joining the sessions. And just arriving in time, we'd also like to welcome Dr. El-Hassim Wan. El-Hassim Wan. Former special representative of the UN Secretary General and the head of the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali, amongst, a lot of other positions. So he'll be with us here at the Institute as well for the month of October, if I'm correct. So warm welcome as well to you. But now without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Christie, who will give us an overview of this exciting publication project, and we then hear by the contributing authors on their specific chapters before the floor is given to the discussant, and then we open up to debate, of course, to the audience online and here. So Professor Christie van der Westhuizen is, of course, very well known here in Leipzig. She was a visiting professor at this very institute in 2022 and is a member of our Scientific Advisory Council. She's an associate professor at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. And as a transdisciplinary scholar interested in identity, difference, ideology, and democracy, and with a specific focus on post-colonial and post-apartheid approaches, she has published widely, both academically and popularly. Apart from the D work, her scholarly books include, for example, as a co-editor as well, the Routledge International Handbook of Critical Studies in Whiteness, published in 2022, where we had a similar launch here some time ago, just to name one of her many publications. So, Christie, it's so great to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Constanze, and thank you to colleagues here at the Research Centre Global Dynamics, and particularly to Prof. Ulf Engel for succumbing to my insistence that I that I launched the D word here. I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to present this work to colleagues here at this university. I've really enjoyed my time here previously, and it's very wonderful to be back in the city. And also at quite an illustrious moment, as I understand, we're celebrating 35 years of the demonstrations on the Augustusplatz that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. So quite an illustrious moment to be here with you today. Thank you for joining us. So we know that this year is also, just in terms of the very recent history of democracy, as because we have to remind ourselves this is actually quite a young phenomenon, historically speaking, the idea of democracy. And we're in more than halfway through a major watershed year, one could say, for democracy, given that something like half of the world's population actually went to the ballot box this year. You had your elections here in Germany. In South Africa, we had very important elections marking our 30 years of democracy. But many other countries as well, and some of them actually delivering unexpected results, like India, for example, where Modi actually came back with a reduced majority, even though he was hoping on the exact opposite. Britain, of course, with quite an interesting, the strengthening of the Labour Party, but if you actually drill down into the numbers, actually quite a thin majority for Labour, and so forth. And of course, I think whether we like it or not, everybody's got their eyes also on the United States, and very worried and also I think generally nervous to see what will happen there in November. So a very important year for us as human beings on the globe. So in a sense, while we have struggles. We've had struggles to deepen democracy over the past many decades, and to make democracy a more and more inclusive. We are definitely also battling the worldwide rise of authoritarian forces that Constanze also just alluded to. So we previously launched this book in South Africa. We've tried to showcase all of the authors' chapters. That's why I'm very happy to have Svetluza here today to speak to her chapter, and then Rashid online. And I'm not going to run through the previous launches, but we had 3 launches in South Africa where we basically managed to get most of our authors to explain more about their chapters. The idea for the book comes out of an international interdisciplinary conference that we held in 2021 with the title "The State We're In: Democracy's Fractures, Fixes and Futures." And out of that came this book, and very much it's a very much an interdisciplinary piece of work. We're also spanning different sectors in the sense of academia, civil society, so people also working as activists to advance democracy. We wanted to bring, one could say, South Africans into conversation with scholars and activists and scholar activists also from elsewhere on the globe, and particularly the European periphery, particularly also reflecting on the Arab world, which is what Rashid is doing. And we've also got a chapter that's titled Queering Democracy in Africa. And there we have 4 people who I would also describe as scholar activists, basically reflecting on advances but also challenges in queering democracy on the African continent. We also let me just see what else I want to talk about specifically. So we've got 4 chapters looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, including Svetluza's. Because, of course, that's something that we still have to reckon with. There's a lot of work happening in this regard, but I would say in the Global South, less work actually happening. And this is an important area to fully understand the ramifications of the COVID-19 pandemic, also politically. And then just to give you a sense of the book itself, it's divided into 4 sections. We've got a section on democracy and the law, practices of democracy and the politics of identities, democracy, political culture and the economy, and then we end off with a section titled Democratic Futures. And in our opening chapter that I've written with Zweletho Jolobi and Siphiwe Dube, we address the disillusionment with democracy. As already alluded to, these are dark times for democracy across the globe. And this is also what we try to capture with our cover art, which is by a South African artist, Ricky Dialoy, which for me captures the kind of ominous moment that we're in terms of democratic futures. We have seen a mass withdrawal of voters from electoral processes in various contexts. We are seeing an opportunistic politics of populism that's trying to capitalize on the socioeconomic misery that's been caused by neoliberal capitalism. And particularly to try and roll back the advances that have been made with representative and accountable democracy during the 20th century. Just to home in on South Africa, we have an Afrobarometer finding that's shown over several years how a growing majority of South Africans are willing to sacrifice democratic gains and agree to an autocratic government in exchange for law and order, housing and jobs. Now, for a young democracy of 30 years, this is very, very troubling. But we also see this elsewhere in the globe, as mentioned, and interestingly, resonances have been found with Latin America as well, with the Americas Barometer actually finding similar results for Latin Americans, for example. If we look at South Africa specifically again, voter turnout has dropped by almost 40% between our first democratic election in 1994 and the democratic election in 2019. We have something like 1 in 3 eligible voters declining to vote in the 2021 local government election. If we look at our election this year, we actually have a turnout, if we count eligible voters, not only registered voters, but eligible voters, our turnout dropped below 40%. So what we argue in the chapter is that the crisis of democracy can be read as a cultural fallout from the economic devastation of neoliberal globalization. We regard the crisis of democracy particularly as a problem of the behavior of political elites. We think that sometimes in some analyses there's a kind of a suggestion that in a sense people who can't grasp democracy properly are making wrong decisions and voting for the wrong people. But we in our chapter argue that you actually see political elites driving a particular opportunistic politics it's also a politics of distraction to actually throw people off course in terms of the real source of socioeconomic misery, and to pin very popularly the problem frequently on foreigners. And this is something that you actually see across the globe. You see resonances of course here on this continent, but in South Africa it's very noticeable. We're struggling with the phenomenon of xenophobia doesn't actually capture it, with the phenomenon of Afrophobia, of basically attacks and violence aimed at people from the rest of the continent of Africa who've arrived in South Africa. So you see these kinds of, and you see very explicit discourses actually pinning the problems of the moment onto foreigners. So you get this very explicit process of scapegoating. So basically, we end off with an argument by saying that what needs to be challenged and what needs to be critically interrogated is how the current neoliberal economic system has actually brought us to this moment, with precarization of vast swaths of populations that have been left over to wallow in extreme socioeconomic misery. And that is actually where the attention should be. Let me. I think I'm going to end on that note, not to take up too much time, and looking forward to questions. And I have to say, I did schlep all the way from South Africa some books, and they are available. I will pass over my author's discount, so they will be available at a very, very decent price of €16. So just to mention, if anybody wants to alleviate my load, that I don't have to, anyway, but thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Christy, for this overview and for taking us through the different section of the book, and appreciating how many different regions have kind of fed into this edited volume. So, without further ado, and of course before we get to questions, we will now move directly to Professor Boutayeb, who I will briefly introduce as well. So he is an assistant professor of social philosophy and ethics at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He has previously worked as a lecturer in philosophy, anthropology, and Islamic studies at various universities in Germany. And he has also authored numerous research papers on the ethics and social philosophy of migration in particular. His most recent publications include Tristesse oblige, eine kleine Philosophie der Nachbarschaft, and modernity and contemporaneity. So, Rashid, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Christy van der Westhuizen for her works, engagement, and solidarity. And at the same time, I apologize for not being able to be there in Leipzig. Given what is happening today, the ongoing wars, the alarming return of the far right, and various forms of tribalism that besiege democracy from all sides, including the neoliberal one, the German concept of guild democracy, Schuldemokratie, seems to be of great importance, and not only for the torturers of the past and their victims. Surely it is impossible to imagine a critical thought today that does not consider the forms of manipulation of historical memory, even within a country like Germany, whose democracy is inconceivable, as Habermas explains, without this critical relationship with the past. What relationship should we build with the past? How is this past being used and misused politically? Why is a democratic transition without a cultural transition doomed to fail? These are some of the questions that have preoccupied me in my text. Undoubtedly, the past and its cultural and religious heritage still play a significant role in Arab and Islamic politics today. A quick look at the Middle East and North African political discourse reveals the negative presence of religion in politics. These uses contrast modernity's epistemological, political, and human rights achievements. Authoritarianism in the region emphasizes particularity over universal values to consolidate its power. It realizes itself also as a cultural hegemony that defends a reductionist doctrine of religious and cultural heritage. Therefore, confronting authoritarianism also requires the construction of a democratic counterculture with a democratic relationship to religion. Let's not forget that in the Arab context, the three manifestations of politics represented by authoritarianism, Salafism, and sectarianism share an ideological interpretation or an imagined past which defends a closed identity and is also responsible for the failure of the modernization project in these regions. The historical experience of Germany and the experience of a post-heroic policy is of great importance for the Arab present. This is precisely what I have chosen to illustrate using a philosophical political reading of German and Arab stamps. He who wants to save his people can only think heroically, it says the slogan of a Nazi stamp. The era of heroism ended with the construction of a democratic system in Germany after the Second World War, but it will continue elsewhere. And where heroism and glory are absent from reality, they will be sought in the past, a real or imagined one, and among the dead. This is depicted in many postage stamps from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. For example, celebrate Saladin, who liberated Jerusalem from the Crusaders. Indeed, we can understand the past as a weapon of the struggle against colonialism, as Nelson Mandela did. Still, simultaneously, Mandela translates it into the language of modernity, law. As the South African sociologist Trevor Ngweni expresses it, the struggle mattered him and made him a man with and not for tradition. I would not have thought of writing this book chapter if not for the small gift I received from Markus Kner, a German theologian and philosopher who, during a scientific trip to Tunisia shortly after the Tunisian Revolution, will acquire a new Tunisian stamp, alien in every way to its Arab context, that shows Bouazizi, the street vendor, and his cart, with a caption describing him as the martyr of the Tunisian Revolution. It was the first time I had seen a face other than that of kings and presidents on an Arab postage stamp. The well-known Moroccan historian Antinka Abdallah Al-Arwi writes in his book on the concept of the state, in the Arab context, we discover state before discovering freedom. What needs to be added to Al-Arwi's words is that the state is detached from the people's destiny and may engage in prolonged destructive wars without consulting the people's opinion. It is a separatist state because it is an unfinished one, in the language of the Tunisian scholar Ali Mizghani. It advocates a modernization that is against modernity and its political and human rights values, and does not hesitate to falsify heritage and drown it in the ideological battles of the present. Thanks for your attention.
Right.
Almost capped.
Thank you so much, Rashid. Yeah, we're very good in time, I realize. So I'm very happy to now give the floor to Dr. Svetluza Surova. And we just briefly present her. She's the president and senior researcher at the Minority Issues Research Institute, headquartered in Bratislava in Slovakia. And as a senior researcher, she investigates minority policies in Serbia and Slovakia, diasporic policies and collective identities of the Slovak minority in Serbia. And she's also working on projects examining the impact of COVID-19 measures on human and minority rights in Slovakia and the political participation of minorities in Serbia, and has been widely published in this regard. And Dr. Surova is also an expert member of the Group of Friends of Minorities in the National Council of Slovak Republic, which has prepared expert analyses of approximately, I think, 70 laws that directly or indirectly concern minorities. Svetluza, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. Let me first just say that I'm very honored and happy to be here today with all of you. Special thanks to Professor Van der Westhuizen and to the organizers of this event. In the chapter for this book, the D word, I have analyzed the official acts of regional offices of public health during the first and second wave of COVID-19 pandemic in Slovakia that especially targeted marginalized Roma communities. And the reason why I did this because Slovakia has deployed heavily securitized responses towards these communities during the first wave of COVID-19 pandemic that resulted in the so-called militarized quarantines. of 6 marginalized Roma communities. And during the second wave, Slovakia was one of a few, if not the only EU member state that continued with these kind of policies and was closing houses, apartment buildings, streets, and entire settlements again. So this was the puzzle that motivated me to do this study. I tried to collect all the official documents that ordered measures for marginalized Roma communities, and I have collected 58 acts, and this is a multi-case study, so each of these acts I was treating as separate research cases, so I have 58 research cases, one for the first wave, 57 for the second wave. And I approached this topic from the political science and rights-based perspective, and I deployed qualitative research design. So in the study, I was looking who ordered this measure, which actor, what kind of measure was ordered, what was the nature of the measure, based on what kind of legal grounds it was ordered, and for what reasons. And since these measures not that only limited fundamental rights and freedoms of these people, they also violated them, I scrutinized all these measures in terms of legality, proportionality, and its duration, their duration. And again, ratio behind this was that the legality and proportionality are the very important elements of the rule of law, and also they can be very useful analytical tools to analyze if the measures adopted during the crisis, such as pandemic was, were in accordance with constitution and parliamentary law. So I created a database, collected, I changed all my research questions, I operationalized them into the indicators I collected data for, and the result of my analysis are that in the first way, with one act, regional hygienist ordered forbade contact with more than 6,000 people living in 6 Roma settlements with the rest of the population. And of course, my analysis showed that yes, regional hygienists can adopt this kind of measure, but not during the public health threat of the second degree and during the state of emergency, which was in place at that time. The public health threat of second degree means that you need to take a special procedure based on a different law that this regional hygienist was acting. So, because the regional hygienist exceeded its scope of competence, the measure was illegal. And when it's something illegal, then you don't do other proportionality and other review. And in the second way, of all analyzed 57 cases, they had the same legal basis. They were basically copy-paste, just concerning different Roma communities. And here in the second way, what has happened that all the measures in the first way were unlawful. And how the legislators dealt with that? So instead of pointing that executive cannot act like this, limiting fundamental rights, they exceeded the powers for Ministry of Health, Public Health Authority, and regional offices of public health. But the Constitutional Court said, no, this is not the way to do it. You can't do it like that. Revoke some provisions. And even specifically said that executive cannot adopt by subordinate legislation the norms that would set up the boundaries of limitation of fundamental rights. In other words, they said that executive cannot limit human rights because this power belongs only to the legislators. But the damage was already done towards the marginalized Roma communities because the regional hygienists were closing them as on the treadmill. And beside all of this, all these measures did not include the termination date, so they were just brought, and then at the end they were all revoked by arbitrary decisions of the hygienists without saying what has changed in epidemic situation in practice. I don't know, yes, I have still 5 minutes, but so the conclusions were that in the first way, the measure lacked the legal basis. The actor who adopted did not follow procedure. It was illegal, unconstitutional. More than 6,000 people had their rights violated. In the second way, 57 measures again lacked the legal basis. Actually, what they did, they said that they act upon the law on the protection of public health, but they ordered something else. They ordered municipalities and cities to control if these people adhere to the quarantine measures ordered, isolation at home, but based on the law, they did not have this competence to entrust these actors. So again, the measure and the execution of the measure was illegal, and more than 43 up till from 40 to 43,000 people were affected with this measure, and again illegally. So yes, quarantine is a standard measure for the protection of the public health, but it cannot be adopted without any constraints. It always has to be legal, proportionate, limited in duration, and also it has to be adopted in an open and transparent way, which did not happen in this case. They did not have any data. I even asked all these regional hygienists. I'm writing now an article about that, and they did not have a data for that, and it was based on the allegedly not adherence to the pandemic measures of these people belonging to these communities. Besides all of this, Slovakia as an EU member state, of course, has a discrete competence in the protection of public health, but it has also other obligations that derive from the international law concerning human and minority rights, and most restrictive measures could not be discriminatory or disproportionate to minorities, which in this case were. So Slovakia failed to recognize de jure guaranteed rights for the most vulnerable people, and this has, of course, a huge impact for democracy, human and minority rights in Slovakia. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Svetluza. I think, this case shows democratic backlash is not only against institutions, but in particular also against minority rights, right? And that there's new administrative practices under legal disguise that come up. I'd now like to give the floor to Professor Ulf Engel to provide reflections, comments, and to maybe start our discussion off also with some open questions. Let me briefly introduce him. Ulf Engel is a professor for politics in Africa at the Institute of African Studies here in Leipzig. He is a visiting professor at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, and a professor extraordinary at the Institute for Political Science at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And he's currently working on the African Union and challenges in the area of peace and security, as well as on theoretical perspectives for research on regional organizations and regionalism in the Global South. Ulf, you have the floor.
Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for the great papers and the really interesting book. Many chapters I truly enjoyed reading. Being a German social scientist, I start off with two slides, two figures. Roman, if you please give me the first one. This is taken from the most recent Bertelsmann Transformation Index that looks into a certain notion of liberal democracy in almost 120 countries worldwide. On a scale from 1 to 10, it simply shows that the number of free and fair elections, association of assembly rights, freedom of expression, separation of power and civil rights declined in the last almost 20 years, no? 18 years. And this is in line with findings that you may have heard of. Larry Diamond, editor of the Journal of Democracy, who in 2008 stated that we are in a democratic recession. This is giving similar data for the African continent, looking at a longer timeline, 1972 to 2023, Freedom House Index data, which has the advantage of running longer timelines. There are some mythological issues, or ideological even. What it shows, looking at political rights and civil liberties is that with the democratic transition and the change in 1989, 1990, we saw an improvement of all these data, which is kind of reflecting on baskets of subdata, on a scale from 1 to 7. And you can see on the left-hand side that the whole debate when it comes to Africa still is below the level of 4, which would qualify as a partly free state or whatever, and that we, importantly, since 2006, have seen again a decline, a recession in the quality of data on democracy in African countries. So, as you can see from that, democracies are, of course, difficult to compare, and the cases discussed in this volume are really quite unique. Of course, there are, unfortunately, rather successful attempts by both liberals and authoritarian nationalists alike to reduce democracy to liberal democracy. You mentioned that at the beginning. This volume, I think, stands out because it's not the usual northern political science talk about democracy or the lack thereof. It brings together different perspectives from mainly South Africa, but also Uganda, Slovakia, and the Arab world, as we've heard. So what are the reasons for the global crisis of legitimacy provided in this volume? Are there any commonalities? And I mean, you already used that quote, but I will repeat it. In the introduction, Christy and colleagues argue that, I quote, opportunistic politics of populism capitalize on the socio-economic misery caused by neoliberal capitalism. If democracy does not deliver what it promises to people, support for democracy dwindles. However, to me, some conceptual questions still need further debate, and I'm just putting that up so that we can enter a debate after. First, in global studies, the varieties of capitalism is a concept acknowledged long time ago, related to Heilbronner, 2008. How does that relate to a seemingly homogeneous understanding of neoliberalism employed in this book by capitalist neoliberalism? Certainly, if you think of it, Thatcherist neoliberalism in the early 1980s is quite different from neoliberalism employed by the African National Congress in the early 1990s, or is different from what German Free Democrats propagate today as neoliberalism. So that's an issue of phrasing and something becoming homogeneous to my like. Secondly, the question becomes particularly important when considering the distorted function of economies in parts of the global south. Numerous examples of state capture, patronage, clientelism are cited in this volume, and this is little to do with neoliberalism as the main. There's a different problem behind it, and you already alluded to the role of elites in that. Thirdly, the concept of the developmental state as proposed by Isaac Kambule, one of the contributors to this volume, raises the interesting question of how the past experience of building developmental states, at least in Africa, which all have been quite authoritarian, fits with the quest for inclusive democracy. So I see a tension between for a developmental state and the practices in the past of those states. Think of Ethiopia, Rwanda, and others. Finally, the demos needs to be specified more precisely that remain outside the institutions. What exactly is the will of the people? And how can this be addressed by research strategies beyond activist arguments? Svetluza's chapter is a good example of how this can be discussed, but we still lack a better understanding of, for instance, why the majority of South African voters did not take part in the May 24 general elections. 62% who were eligible did not take part. And this is a huge decline if compared to the first elections, 1994 and 1998. However, over and above, the volume is posing a number of very pertinent questions which are addressed from different angles. It would be worthwhile to expand the inquiry beyond the country case studies and empirically researched similar or related questions in other African countries, in Latin America and Southeast Asia, to name but a few global regions where democracy is in retreat too. And sitting here in Leipzig today, on 10th of October, I suppose we have enough reason to ask ourselves, how is it that a growing majority of the people wants to abolish democracy by democratic means? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ulf. I think this gives us already a lot of points to further discuss. Before we open this discussion up to the audience, maybe we give the panelists a chance to address some of the comments by Ulf Engel. And is there anyone who would like to start? Maybe a hand to Christy, and then Svetluza and Rashid can join in.
I want to trust Ulf to come with all the hard questions. Thank you so much. I do think that neoliberalism definitely, like other ideological phenomena, is a historically contingent phenomenon, and therefore it's not always the same in all places and at all times. So but we broadly understanding as neoliberalism here is in my other writing I use a lot of Wendy Brown's understanding of like a more expansive understanding of neoliberalism as a rationality. But if you drill it down to economic policy, then for me it refers to deregulation, liberalization, informalization, and so forth. And the slimming down of the state's welfare functionalities, the boosting of its security functionalities, and so forth. The idea of the state as becoming its primary function is actually to protect capital and profit making, basically. But of course, within that very broad sketch, you will have different varieties and different extents to which countries actually employ neoliberalism. And in South Africa, we have seen that the ANC has brought in quite a strong social democratic dimension in the form of the biggest social security network on the African continent, with something like, I think the last time I looked, it's, for example, we've got about, I think it's almost half of our population now are able to access some kind of social security support. So that is significant. And that's, of course, to try and ameliorate the impact of neoliberal capitalism. But we have all the, we've got the commodification of water. We've got various other, if you look at just capital flows and how and exchange control and those kinds of phenomena that one, the over reliance on foreign investment, all of those kinds of features we find in the South African example. So I do think that you probably won't find anywhere in the world a pure neoliberal, purely neoliberal state. I think if you find different inflections, and it depends also on the particular historical development of that state. In our country, of course, we come from a particularly extractive capitalist past, with almost like a murderous kind of capitalism. And I'm not saying that lightly. Given that our economy is by and large based on minerals, and particularly deep level gold mining, and the number of miners who are black men who've sacrificed their lives for the economy of South Africa, because of the dangers associated with that kind of, but at the same time, not only the dangers, the fact that there was a chronic underpayment of people. So in terms of remuneration, not being properly remunerated, to the extent that mine workers were receiving less income in 1970 than they were receiving in 1920. So there you can actually see how that system that we call racial capitalism, how it actually worked as a super extractive, super exploitative system with a very clear racial inflection. And so the shift in neoliberalism actually already happens under the National Party in the late 1970s. And I write about that in my first book, White Power. But yeah, so it takes. So I think, and I'm mentioning this historical context because I think neoliberalism will pan out differently depending on the historical context. Then, in terms of the state capture, yes, in fact, the beneficiaries and what shall we call them? Not the creators, but the state capturers. Generally are quite outspoken against neoliberalism, but one could also say that they actually involve a faction of the ruling party that is the ruling party, the African National Congress in South Africa, that's particularly opposed to a more neoliberal faction in the party. So neoliberalism is still playing a role there, but your state capturers, using a kind of a revolutionary rhetoric, is trying to position themselves against neoliberal capitalism. Then Isaac Kambule's chapter, I take your point around developmentalism on the African continent. Certainly it has been associated with authoritarianism, and in fact frequently was used as the ruse for authoritarianism, in a sense that a centralized state is the only way to drive development. And so what Isaac Kambule is trying to say is it possible for us to have a developmental state, but that's framed within our constitution? And I think that the link there is that our constitution is unusual for the fact that it includes socioeconomic rights. And so the way I'm understanding his argument, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, is that he's saying, is there a possibility for us to actualize those socioeconomic rights in such a way that we actually create a developmental state that is still democratic? So it is in the democratic futures section of the book. So it is, Isaac sort of challenging us to sort of think further and trying to open a conversation on that. Then the uncounted, in terms of who they are, just briefly. So in our chapter, we do try to explain this mass withdrawal from the electoral process by South Africans. The way that we're understanding it is that there's been such a disillusionment with holding politicians to account through the usual process of elections, that people have now found other or are trying other methods, and that's basically kind of how it's playing out is violent protests at community level, where South Africa is a very protest-intensive society. Some say we've got more protests than anywhere else in the world, but we've got more of everything than anywhere else in the world. So that's why I don't completely buy it. But one thing is true: we are very protest-intensive, and I think the point there is that people have decided to take it to community-level protests to make direct appeals to particularly councillors, and then with the hope that national-level politicians will pay attention and come and resolve the problems. So we frequently actually have that situation where a national-level politician will go and visit the specific community, hear all about the grievances, promise X, Y, and Z, and then nothing happens after that. And I think that's why we've also seen protests becoming more violent in an attempt to attract attention and have some kind of impact in terms of change. But that shows you the level of disillusionment, where people feel, through a direct appeal. I'd rather try and launch a direct appeal through violence at community level and hoping to achieve some kind of outcome. And these are, because these protests are usually about issues around socioeconomic development. You know, so just to answer, I made a little bit of a dent in your very hard questions. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christy. At this point, is there anything Rashid and Svetluza would like to add from your cases or perspectives? Or shall we go? Yes, Rashid? Yes. Go ahead.
Not directly. I mean, concerning the problem of neoliberalism and democracy, I think it's interesting to take a look on the writings of the German economic sociologue Wolfgang Streeck, especially his work Buying Time on the delayed crisis of the democratic capitalism, the processes of de-economization of democracy and de-democratization of economy. And at the same time, I want to mention also the work of social philosopher Nancy Fraser. For example, in his short book, The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born, she thematized the divorce in a context like the US-American one, the divorce between the politics of acknowledgement and the social justice. For Fraser, we cannot criticize, for example, the pathology, the democratic pathology of or the populism as a pathology of democracy without addressing problems of social inequalities.
Yeah, Professor Elf, you mentioned a few important points that I would like to refer to my work and showcase their shortcomings, such as you mentioned, inclusive democracy. All these things that I was talking about, my research happened in a institutionally inclusive context of EU member state in 21st century. I didn't want to be dramatic in the first expose, but now in the loose discussion, I can tell you how that happened. The police with army, with the guns, came to the Roma settlements, they taped it and were guarded for days and weeks. And nobody could have come out. And they didn't care what happened inside. They said they had to bring these measures to protect those people. But in my previous study on securitization and this militarized quarantine, I claimed that they actually exposed them to coronavirus. So again, this happened now in the in a country with good rankings from Freedom House when it comes to democracy. So, but that leads me to another thing, that we have democracy in normal times and then we have a crisis. And it's very, very, very important to look how democracy functions during the crisis. And what we know from the past, that during the crisis, always those most vulnerable suffer the most. And that's why I think, as Christy said in her opening words, that it's important to do more research about COVID-19 pandemic and its implications for democracies. So, and then, yes, about these inclusive democracies, I wanted to say about, you said that, I will paraphrase, that when politicians don't deliver what they promises, that can, create these illusions. But my case also shows how politicians, how, I even write that in my chapter, how you expect that the people will follow the rules if you as a state authority do not act upon it. You know, because state authorities, they can act only based on the constitution as regulated by laws. And then they have the laws that they actually vote for in parliament, and they don't act in accordance with this law. So what we can expect from the people, how we can even say, you know, and there was all kind of debate how during the pandemic, everybody were blaming those people, you know, they didn't want to adhere to the measures and they were calling them nasty names and so on. And then we have one of the hygienist or doctor who was all the time in the media saying how we have to wear, you know, protection and distance ourselves dancing on some party. You know, not distancing at all. So, and that brings me, you mentioned to the third point that I wanted to make a reference, the demos. Yes, who is demos, what they want, and so on. But we have to know that there is like a people and there is like a people. And in this case, we see that there is like also second-class citizens, because Roma were treated like a second-class citizens. Not during the crisis, all the time. But this is the extreme to what this kind of doing business as usual, what can actually, to what kind of end can lead. So during the crisis or during the normal times, we always have to stick to the rules, and always the rights of people have to be respected. And let me see. That is all I wanted to say. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Then it's time now to open up the discussion. So please feel free to share your comments, questions, of course online as well. You can use the chat function. Yeah, I think we have a microphone. I already see one hand up. That's very good. And please briefly introduce yourself with name and institution before you pose the question. So we have a first question here. It's for the online guests as well.
Hey, so I'm Joshua Herbert. I'm a student at Universitat Leipzig. I've just started a master's in European Studies. I'm from the UK as well. So I have a couple of questions, but the first, most pressing one, I want to sort of aim towards van der Westhuizen. I agree with a lot of your sentiment on the theories about neoliberalism being a root cause of sort of socioeconomic driving factor that then this sort of democratic recessions that we're seeing for the best part of a couple of decades now, I would say. But it does seem as well that at the same time, while I think this is not a particularly controversial opinion, and you hear it sort of quite widely in academic sort of circles, it seems that time and time again, up until very recently now, the political, quote-unquote, lessons that are being learned from elections is almost the exact opposite, that sort of centrist neoliberal policies and politicians are going to be the saviors of this sort of lurch to the far right. I think that we see this in a lot of countries, the UK in particular, sort of Labour going far more towards the sort of new Labour principles of the late 90s, and sort of this idea that we don't want extremists on either side, so that would indicate anything extremely towards the left, so it's sensible centrism that will save the day. And even more poignantly, I think, in the French elections, where the coalition of the left was the sort of driving factor that stopped Le Pen's party. And now, I think in the last month or so, we've seen the appointment of Michel Barnier as the new prime minister, who is far more centrist than anyone from that coalition of parties that were actually successfully democratic, or democratically successful. So it just seems that time and time again we're seeing in the sort of big players of the European Union, or the UK, no longer in the European Union, that it seems to be the opposite lessons that are being learned, that to combat extremists of the far right, we need much more solid centre ground, and that would be more business as usual, more neoliberalist policies that has, I seem to be sort of understanding what you're saying, actually been the root cause of this stuff for a long period of time. So how do we combat that being the lesson that is learned by politicians and political systems?
Great, thank you so much. Can we take some more questions? Is that fine? Can we accumulate some questions, Christy?
Cheryl.
Oh, yes, please, sure.
Hi, Constance. Thank you to Christy and the other authors of the book. I haven't read the book, but just listening in, I also had the challenge of simply placing the problem on the shoulder of neoliberalism. It seems to me that neoliberalism and democracy in Africa almost go hand in hand in terms of the emergence, that they are intrinsically linked there. And I'm wondering if the book pays sufficient attention to the forms of democracy. It's a particular form of democracy that also comes into Africa, the procedural form rather than substantive democracy, and how to unpack that a little bit more. Yes, political elites, but more and more I'm beginning to think around political culture. We have neglected to look at political culture for various reasons in the 50s and 60s. This was a particular focus of modernization theory, and it didn't sit well with us. But I'm wondering if there isn't something there that we need to go and uncover again. And then just in terms of South Africa and the drop in voter turnout, there's definitely a lack of trust, and the Afrobarometer also shows this trust deficit in political parties and institutions themselves. And the IEC, we must remember, was also under attack just before those elections as well. And so the credibility of those elections were also at stake. And then I'm playing around with this notion of democracy as a conflict resolution mechanism. And if it's failing, what does that say about conflict resolution as a whole and the mechanisms that we need to think about? So I guess I'm asking us to unpack not just the economic systems as a challenge, but to go to the political system as well and construct that too.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Any other questions at this point? And then maybe let me add one also that might be interesting to hear from Svetluza and Rashid. You know, when you were exchanging with other chapter authors on different regions, different kind of national contexts, did you come across any cases of where you thought, oh, this is quite similar, or there's even some type of maybe learning process between either pro or anti-democratic forces that are ongoing between different regions, between different of the cases that we're looking at? Like maybe mimicking of rhetoric or even like more substantial kind of exchanges. So if there's anything in your work that you came across when you were doing your workshop or, you know, when you were engaging as chapter authors, that would be very interesting. And now I hand the floor back to our panelists. Anyone who would like to start? I know most questions were going to the direction South Africa, so maybe we can start there.
Okay, thank you. No, thanks for those questions. Well, I think that the fact that the political lessons are not landing with our political elites is to do with how power relations have been organized actually very effectively by neoliberalism over the past 40-odd years. And you've seen... because for me, neoliberalism is actually a fundamentally anti-democratic phenomenon, and it has worked as a system to roll back the advances that have been made, particularly through social democracy, and what's happened is you've had a massive redistribution of wealth, upward, up the pyramid, and we're all familiar with the 1% phenomenon, etc., etc. So you have a completely newly skewed distribution of wealth, with an over concentration at the top of the pyramid, and we have our political classes running basically with the economic classes on this. So with your super wealthy, and so forth. And in that sense, our politics has become very much infected by this neoliberal way of looking at the world. For me, it's been a very effective system to undo the gains made in terms of democracy and human rights in the wake of the Second World War. It's been extremely effective in that, and to take us back to a situation of elites that are beyond account, who are unaccountable, who cannot be called to account, and where political elites are actually buffering economic elites, from the great unwashed, which includes in the neoliberal system the middle class. Because if we look at the middle class actually shrinks under neoliberalism. People actually drop out of the middle class, and a new kind of underclass, which is not so new anymore because it's now been going on for a number of decades, has been created. That's been called variously the precariat, but I think the term the precariat actually captures this situation of informalization. In fact, and I think that the left have not been able to actually meet the challenge of this, because if you, and I'm just thinking in terms of South Africa's left, which is very much still married to ideas around Marxism, Leninism, and so forth. But here we've got a capitalism now that has actually moved to the point where the worker has become superfluous. The worker is so the whole idea of an organized working class, then, that must be the motive force that will now bring us to a socialist nirvana. That is, that working class cannot form, because the worker has been done away with. And we've got in South Africa, so that's why I think that the global north have a lot to learn actually from how capitalism has been happening. Our neoliberal capitalism has been playing out on the periphery of the capitalist world order. And in South Africa, for example, the fact that we've got almost 50% of our population, because we've got two definitions. The one is a narrow definition that doesn't count people that have given up looking for work. But if you count both people who are still looking for work and people who've given up looking for work, so then we're almost at the 50% unemployment rate. So so we're talking about structural unemployment. So basically, in our system, the worker has become superfluous. So and of course, technological changes have accelerated this process, and AI is now bringing us into a whole new situation around actually understanding what is the future of the worker. So I think basically you've got you've got your political class that is acting at the behest of your economic elites. If we look at the US system at the moment, for example, with on the one hand a venture capitalist, as deputy president or vice presidential candidate, running with Trump. Kamala Harris, who's well known to be close to very particular sections of capital as well, and so forth. And I think that that politicians at this point in time they're actually disregarding the will of the people. The idea, of course, that neoliberalism could be centrist is, for me, not correct, because neoliberalism I see actually as a right-wing phenomenon, because it is fundamentally anti-democratic. And it's fundamentally against the participation of people, and it's very elitist in its outlook. So, but you're right that this is how our political spectrum has become so skewed, that neoliberal actors who frequently call themselves socialists still, which that's the ridiculousness of where we are now. So these are neoliberal actors who call themselves socialists, who regard themselves as centrists, but in fact they are serving a right-wing ideology. So these are the complications that we are in. And Cheryl, thanks for your question as well. And I think that certainly in South Africa there has been a neoliberalization of our democracy through an emphasis on proceduralism. But I would argue that this actually comes, in a sense, there's a strong strand in the ruling party that became enamored with neoliberalism, but that who are also, and this is now part of this contradictory ideological moment, who are also Leninists. And I think neoliberal technocracy links quite nicely into the Leninist idea of a vanguard party and a group of select cadres who knows definitely better than we do, and we should just be quiet and bring out our vote every 5 years, but the rest of the time leave the complicated business of government over to the political class. And that was a kind of a line from the ANC almost from the word go in the late 1990s already. So there's been an active attempt at the demobilization of people in South Africa, which goes quite against the kind of discourse that people frequently think that the ANC is busy with, which is about power to the people and all of that. But in fact, what you actually see is a discourse of demobilization, and then interspersed with selective mobilization. So when we need the people, then the masses must now come and do our bidding, basically. So, but it's when the leaders decide it's now time for the masses to make some kind of point on behalf of the ruling party. So, let me stop at that point and maybe allow some of our other panelists some inputs as well. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you. Rashid, do you want to respond to some of the questions?
Concerning the similarities between the different contexts, I want especially to mention the conflict between Eros and Demos in East Europe as in the Arab world. In East Europe, it expressed itself in populism, in a nationalist Catholicism, in xenophobia, etc. And in the Arab world, as I mentioned it, in a persistent authoritarianism. That's why we have to defend also outgoing of the social philosophy of the modernity from Marx until Bourdieu, and don't forget also John Dewey, the idea that democracy is not only a form of government, but it is a way of life, an art or a kind of societal education, or in the words of a German philosopher Axel Honneth, the art of democratic ethical life and demokratische Sittlichkeit. I think in the neoliberal context, we are dealing with a democracy from above, and it seems to collaborate with the neoliberal erosion of social institutions.
Well, there were similarities to those chapters that were dealing with democracy and the law. And there was one chapter that dealt with one case that ended up on Constitutional Court in South Africa for scrutinizing if the measures were the petitionist wanted to Constitutional Court to scrutinize to defend democracy, that if these measures were democratic or not. And difference, I have to say, it's really nice to see Rashid like this. I have to say that my chapter was ridiculously long, and thank you, Christy, for approving that. And really horrible to read. I don't recommend to nobody. But I have to say that Rashid chapter I had the opportunity to read at the workshop, before the workshop, and I have to say that was not a chapter, it was a belletry. It was so nicely written that I was looking, what is this scientific work, or which writer wrote this? It was really, really nicely written. So. Thank you, Rashid, for that experience.
But I should add that it's definitely not a horrible chapter to read. I mean, we did slim it down somewhat, make it, But the thing is, there was it's partly to do with the fact that you've got a very solid database that Svetluza had actually built up. So there were a lot of details. But that, to me, also speaks to the substance of your chapter. The fact that it's really a substantial chapter built on proper data. That apparently various power brokers in the Slovakian society are trying to get their hands on this database. So it's quite a solid piece of work.
Yeah, but not to quote it, just to throw it to the trash, to remove it. Not that. So.
Well, because of suppression. More to do with suppression, as I understand.
They want to get rid of their evidence, and if I can say now as a self-promotion, something small thing, I really wanted to do this as for the future. I wanted to collect and document everything what has happened, because I know that because these measures were published on the internet site, and that can be all gone one day, and nobody will know what has happened, because Slovakia actually sold this, as I said to Professor Elf before this event, as a success story. This is a success story of the Slovak MPs in European Parliament selling to their colleagues. So they showcased how you should actually treat Roma. And the difficulty why nobody really wants to talk or to pick up on this topic is because in the state also you said we have demos, we have elites. I agree with Christy what you said in your expose, how it's important to look at that. But we have also so many different actors. And doing this research as a political scientist, I was really surprised to see how many actors actually were participating in these illegal discriminatory activities. And what was the striking finding is that those people who daily help those Roma, in those communities, they were the executors. They did not say no. They could have said no. They were arguing to me because before this chapter, I did also LED interviews with all these people who were making decisions about these measures and implementing them and evaluating them. And they were saying to me, like if we don't do it, maybe somebody else will do it and they will be worse than us. But what kind of argument is this? I know I'm into Germany now. I don't want to put the salt on the wounds from the last century, but so they were saying we are humanitarians. We bring human aid where is needed. Really? But many things on this study I have also learned and understood as a political scientist. And what is most important, that how I got the data. Nobody asked me that, because of course they know. But actually they were willing to share, because they were willing even to speak with me, because they all wanted to persuade me how this was the right decision. And even those regional hygienists that I mentioned, I spoke with them that they brought this decision, and the end of the interview was, please don't think that I'm a racist. I'm not a racist. You know, but I was not there as a psychologist. I was there as a researcher, and I was listening to everything. But you know, they had a need to persuade me that they are good people, but not me. I think they were persuading more themselves. So that was one side of the story, and the other side of the story I just share with you, because you are all colleagues studying that. You know, some people were sharing because they were in a political rivalry with somebody else. Even in the same government, I got the data for the other research on testing from the first wave. So they said it's a lot of positively in those 6 marginalized Roma communities, 6,000 people. And they said everybody is positive. We had to close them. They didn't want to say the exact number. And then I asked from the Ministry of Defense, and they sent my request to the army, and they sent me their database, not the number, the database. So I could see how they classify, what was important, how they organize and everything, which was for me like, wow. And of course, there were very little cases, you know, positive, 38, if I remember, or not from 6,000 people. But many times when I ask, it's like even that they were in the same government or colleagues, that they wanted to share, you know, just to do the harm to the others or so. So it was actually, I got a lot of data. And just to finish, what with this, because this is, you know, it was published, but I was trying last year hard to get some response from the government, previous and this new, to remedy these people, to apologize to them, maybe even to bring a law. Because there is a similar situation in the past happened to Roma women. They forcibly sterilized them, and now in Slovakia they try to prepare a law for that. And this is on that, I think, on the same level, but this was not yet successful. But I hope that maybe something will change and these people will see the justice, because 50,000 people almost for several weeks to be held there hostages, it's not acceptable.
Yeah, thank you so much, Svetluza. I think it's always very important to also have a glimpse into these insights, these practical elements of the research and the interactions with the people on the ground. Thank you so much. And of course, if you wanna support the important documentation of cases like this, it was mentioned already, there's some hard copies available that you can purchase after this event, I think with Christy. So don't forget about that. But we have time for a last quick round of questions in case there's still anything on your minds. Yes, I see one hand up here.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm from Uni Leipzig. I just started my master in global studies. And I will try to understand my question because they're in Portuguese. I'm from Brazil, and I was thinking, I have 3 questions for one of each. I hope it's okay. Sure. I would like to ask to Christy, I know you were more writing about South Africa, but I come from South America, and I think we have a very similar colonial backgrounds. So I would like to ask to you, like, what is the challenge and the limits of democracy when we are talking about the global South? Because are countries that came from a colonial background and then at some point democracy. Yeah. So how we can think and manage democracy when we don't have the learning experience, but we are getting this from outside? And I think this is a bit connected with the question I want to do to Hashid. I'd really like it that you talk about what uses we do from the past when we rebuild democracy all the time. And so I would like to ask you how we can think democratic reference when they don't exist in the country. So for example, in the case of Brazil, we still learn democracy from outside, yeah, European democracy, US democracy, how we can think about democratic past when it doesn't exist, yeah? We have natives and then colonial times and then purported democracy that was not built with the people. So I don't know if you have an answer, and I study history, and I don't think I have an answer for this, but I would like to see if you have some ideas how we could think about it. And to Svetluza, I really, really like the exposition about COVID. It was very interesting. I also studied a bit of COVID in Brazil for some time in the bachelor. And I would like to ask you if you found, what ways you found to think about democracy when we are looking to these groups that are marginalized or not even considered part of the people, when democracy are not working for them. And if you see this hygienist policy, you can also see this in other groups from the society, for example, poor people or immigrants, or if this is not something that you get through it. Yeah, that's my question. Sorry if it was too much.
Thank you so much. That's great. One question per panelist. So that would also be kind of rounding up the discussion, so kind of the last words. And I guess we go in the same order, Christy.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think in the South African case, the struggle has always been for democracy. So the imagination, the political imagination has actually centered on the idea of democracy. And I don't think that the sense is that democracy is an imposition from outside. So the ANC that's now ruling with in a coalition government with a reduced majority, but they ruled for the past, between 1994 and 2024. And they are the oldest liberation movement on the African continent. And I would say very much that the political imagination that they carried with them was centered on democracy. What happened with them in exile, of course, is a whole other very long conversation that we can't go into now. But inside the country, if you look at the anti-apartheid uprisings and the anti-apartheid movement, it was very much, again, built around the democratic imaginary. And so I think there was a real sense from, so the sense is that democracy is something that is sought and that can be created through practices, by South Africans. And as Rashid was saying, that's also how we're approaching it in the book. We're also approaching it very much as a practice. But in most recent times, because we've got a constitution that entrenches certain rights, that has got certain principles that are quite liberal democratic, but then we've also got social democratic dimensions to the constitution. So there has been an attempt to suggest that the constitution is somehow a Western import or a Western imposition. But that is being very much contested because we've had, I think, one of our foremost senior counsels, who's also an author, Tembeka Nkukatwebe is his name. He represented South Africa actually in the case at the case against Israel now recently. And he's written a book, for example, where he traces the beginnings of the Constitution to black lawyers at the beginning of the 20th century. So I think there's quite an intense contestation at the moment around just handing democracy on a platter to the West and to say that democracy is a Western idea. I think, in fact, I regard it as an insulting idea that African people can't imagine democracy and can't practice democracy. And I don't know if Dimitri wants to say something about the special edition of Comparative that's just come out, but but the that democratic imaginary that you actually find in other post-independence African states as well. And then what happens with the political elites, that's a different question. But I think that there's a disjuncture between the position of the political elites and how people understood this moment, this emergence into independence, and the kinds of democratic rights that they wanted to claim for themselves. And then you've got something else happening with the political elites. So for me, that differentiation is very important. And this kind of research that went into the special edition, let me do a little plug for it. Comparatief, latest, I think it's the latest edition. Read all about it. So this is, do you want to say a few words? But yeah, this post-independence moment and this disconnect actually that you see emerging between political elites and people. Anyway.
Constitution into Afrikaans.
Yeah, well, I did do that indeed. Yes. Anyway. Okay, but thank you for that. Thanks everybody for the questions and the comments. Appreciated.
Thanks, Chrissy. Rashid.
Yes, concerning the question of historical memory and how to deal with it, I mentioned in my text two famous philosophers,